welcome back. We just started a section where we will introduce ourselves with some of the basic terms for cybersecurity. Now, I know theory is usually the boring part, but there are certain things that we need to know first before we dive into the stuff like working with firewalls, using different tools, installing antiviruses, and all of that. That's why it's good that we first start talking about most basic goals of having cybersecurity. Now, we already mentioned in the first video why we need cybersecurity, but right now let's try to narrow down to specific reasons and explain why each of them is important. First of all, we can say there are three main goals of cybersecurity. Now, different companies implement different cybersecurity plans and strategies, but all of them have these three things in common. First goal of cybersecurity is confidentiality. Now, confidentiality simply means keeping the sensitive data private and accessible to only authorized users. This is important for both privacy and security reasons. We always want to be the only ones who can access our own data. For example, important company data has to only be available to certain employees and to people who need access to it for their work. You would never want your business plans and strategies to go public and to be accessible to anyone wanting to exploit that or to be accessible to your competitors. Because remember, there will always be people who would want to get their hands on the data for their own reasons. Now, this data can be anything from business plans for a company to accessing money for online banks to perhaps accessing private user information on certain websites. Imagine any of that leaking to the open world and for that data to be accessible without any authorization whatsoever. That company would lose credibility fast. That's why preventing access to everyone and giving access to certain people is a good approach to protecting your data. This can be done by encrypting the data, by using password and two-factor authentication to access the data. The more steps to authenticate someone, the better. However, this is not the only important thing for cybersecurity. We also need integrity. Now, integrity is ensuring that even if the data is being transferred between the right endpoints after successful authorization, it must not be altered with in the transmission. We always want to receive the exact and correct data that was sent, and we don't want it being intercepted and read or changed. This is where encryption also comes in play by making the data unreadable, even if it gets intercepted. If, for example, some software is being downloaded, we must make sure it's also the correct one so we don't end up running something malicious. And besides all of this, we also must make sure that anything of importance to us has a well-secured backup. So even if somehow data gets deleted or changed or encrypted by a ransomware, for example, we will still have it in our backup. And the third goal of cybersecurity is availability. This means that even after all of our security strategy implementation, we must make sure that the data is easily accessible to people who must access it, for whatever reason. Sometimes, if you implement too much security measures, things start running slow, which is normal as it has to go through a bunch of security checks. We must make sure that the strategy is implemented securely and correctly, but also that it doesn't decrease the speed too much. Now, for regular people like me and you, whether speed is 10% less or not doesn't really matter much to us, but for big financial companies, speed decreasing can lead to huge financial losses depending on what they do. Nonetheless, these would be three main goals to always have in mind when developing a security strategy, and always ask yourself whether these three measures were met. Okay, in the next video, we're going to talk about blue teams and red teams, which is another cybersecurity term. Alright, blue team, and red team. These are the terms that you will hear a lot if you decide to work in security field. You will also most likely work in one of these if cybersecurity is your career path. So let's quickly explain what are they. First, we have a blue team, which is a defensive security team that consists of professionals responsible for maintaining the defense against all cyber attacks and responsible for creating a security strategy. And on the other side, we have a red team. Red team consists of security professionals who are trained to attack and break into the systems. Now, it's important to have both of these teams. Imagine it like a small war between one another, which helps to increase security overall. Blue team, which is responsible for defense strategy, can improve the strategy if red team succeeds to break into it. Blue team has their own methods of protecting and establishing a security strategy. This can be, for example, setting up firewall, setting up honeypots and antivirus softwares, and logging softwares on the endpoint devices. Of course, other than just setting up those softwares, it is important to regularly monitor the traffic and the occurrences on the secured network and devices. On the other hand, red team is, as we said, responsible for breaking those defenses and getting access to the systems or compromising the target network. Same way blue team has their defense strategy, red team has its attack strategy, which consists of information gathering, fingerprinting, scanning the target, and performing vulnerability analysis to find a weak point or a vulnerability in the system. Then they can use different methods such as social engineering, phishing, exploiting known vulnerabilities, and running payloads and exploit codes against the target. Now, besides blue and red team, there is also something called purple team. Purple team doesn't have to be a single team, but in most cases it is. Its job is to bring the red and the blue team together to work and to share information. Now, you might be asking, well, isn't this logical already? Yes, but the red team's success is essentially measured by blue team's failure. And nobody wants to be the one failing, so sometimes blue team might not report something to the red team or vice versa. That's why there must be someone who can manage both teams and encourage them to share information, as the ultimate goal at the end is to have the best possible security and not to see who performed better. Remember at the beginning of the course when I mentioned something called an asset? Well, it is an important term when creating a security strategy. Now, asset is not always the same thing, so we can't define what it is, as it depends from company to company. However, we can define it broadly as an asset being most valuable thing that company or a person has. Of course, there can be multiple assets and each of them can have their own value, but it's important that before even developing a security strategy, you talk to the person hiring you or you talk to the company that you are developing the strategy for and discuss what are their most important assets. This is important because if the strategy is really good, what's the point if it's protecting the wrong things, right? Now, as we mentioned, assets can be literally anything. It can be files that the company has. It can also be perhaps the main servers of the company that are required for it to run. Sometimes an asset can be physical assets such as hard drives that have a backup. Remember, security isn't always implemented just online. You can just as easily have someone physically walk into the office or break into the office and steal device or hard disk or just look through them and put them back. And in some cases, asset can be personal information, whether it being for one person or for all the users that are registered on a specific service or website. That is also an important asset for companies. We already discussed that a company can lose its reputation if its users' private information gets stolen or leaked. These are one of the most usual assets to protect and to focus on, but as I said, it can be anything, and it's important to always communicate about this with the person that you are developing the strategy for. Usually, when protecting assets, we want to ensure those are our strongest points in security, and we can develop something called layered security around it. This means we have multiple security measures covering it, so in case one gets broken into, there are still more things protecting it. Most basic example of a layered security that you all most likely have encountered and used is two-factor authentication. For example, if your password gets leaked and hackers get it, you still have your code arriving at your mobile phone or email, which is still needed to log into your account. In this case, an attacker not only needs to know your password, but he must also know the code for two-factor authentication. Anyways, now that we know what asset means, let's move on to the next lecture. Okay, this is an important topic. What are the most common ways that different organizations get compromised? Now we can go in history and take a look at different types of the attacks that occurred on some larger companies and analyze the attacks like that. And we will do something similar towards the end of the course. But right now, I want to discuss most common types of the attacks. Now, usually it starts small, by an attacker compromising just one device within that company. Usually that device was the weakest point that allowed the attacker to get access to the inside network. And that device most commonly isn't what the attacker wants, so the attacker can use it to further on enter the company by using different methods to infect other devices and perhaps even the servers where he can extract the wanted data or make his presence unknown and keep monitoring everything. Usually the attacker will drop some type of payload, whether it being a backdoor, a keylogger, a ransomware, or any type of software that will allow him to achieve what he wants with that device. But all of this sounds easy. However, it can sometimes be extremely hard or close to impossible to infect some system, especially if it's heavily protected with the best security strategies. But there are also companies that don't want to invest too much into security and they later pay the bigger price after getting compromised. One of the most common ways that systems and devices get hacked is through unpatched vulnerabilities. Now, this is usually due to some service or software running on a device that didn't receive latest updates or patches. This is why it is always important to regularly update your device operating system as well as all of the services that it might have. Always update to the latest version. Now, how hackers discover this is usually a standard procedure. First, we have a developer writing a code for some software. The developer might not pay that much attention to security details, so when the attacker looks through the same software, whether by reverse engineering it, or by disassembling it, or simply by just checking the code of the software if it is open source. He can perhaps notice a vulnerability or a bug within that code. The developer isn't aware of that issue, so he sends his software that later gets deployed by some company and perhaps starts running on a server. And the attacker who is aware of the bug can try and weaponize it in order to get access to that server. There, he can install his payload, which then gives him the full control of that server and all of that because of a small bug in the code. Now, when we say unpatched vulnerabilities, we can differentiate two types of vulnerabilities. The already existent and known vulnerabilities that have patches, and the what we call zero-day vulnerability. Now, the first one is self-explanatory. It is already a known vulnerability and it has a working patch or update available for it, and there are also existent exploit codes online for this vulnerability. So when a company gets compromised through this type of vulnerability, it is usually due to their lack of updates. Now, this might seem like everyone won't get exploited like this, however, sometimes there are a lot of libraries and softwares that you have to keep an eye on and patch them regularly on time, and this can be overwhelming for a smaller company. On the other hand, we have more serious and more dangerous zero-day vulnerabilities. Now, we will devote more time to them later, but what a zero-day essentially is a vulnerability that was not discovered yet, nor it has a patch available for it. Zero-day can be a threat to anyone, especially if it's found in an operating system or some widely used library. Besides unpatched vulnerabilities, probably even more dangerous and most common way of attacking is social engineering, specifically phishing. Now, unlike the previous mention where you exploit software, here you exploit people. It doesn't need to have a software vulnerability. It is essentially tricking people into doing something that they shouldn't be doing. Let's say an employee logs into the company's server every day for work. He uses his username and password in order to do so, and he visits the login page on that server to provide his credentials. Now, what an attacker can do is clone that page and make it look exactly the same as the official company page. Then send the employee that page to login. Now, he wouldn't do this directly. He could use some various methods to make the employee actually open this page through various social engineering tactics. Then, if the employee falls for this and provides his credentials to the fake page, the attacker would then get those credentials and can use them to log into the server and get access to it like that. And the third most common vulnerabilities that get a company or a device compromised is weak credentials. Now, this is something you probably heard a billion times, but it's true. Having strong credentials is very important as a security measure. For example, the username and password that you see right here will get almost any company compromised due to its password being rather weak. For example, more appropriate and stronger password would be something like this. Now, of course, besides these three things that we discussed, these are not all the ways to compromise a company. These are just broad examples, and all of these attacks can be different depending on many factors. The point is that there are many outside threats for every company out there, and not just for companies but also for regular people. That's why it's important not to only provide a good security strategy, but to also educate the employees in a company of the ways that they can be targeted. Okay, now that we covered some of the most common ways that companies are targeted, let's proceed to the next lecture. Okay, so what I want to talk about real quick is different types of securities out there. Now, we already mentioned this briefly when we talked about different paths in the beginning of the course, but I want to talk in a little more detail right now, just so we all understand that there are many branches in this field and that there will be something interesting for everyone. One of the first securities that we got is mobile security. Now, this one needs no explaining. Mobile security is a cybersecurity field that deals with the protection portable computing devices from threats and vulnerabilities. Devices such as phones and laptops can easily be stolen or found in public places, cabs and offices, and among other places as well. And from a cybersecurity perspective, what is more worrying is the amount of sensitive data that can be recovered from the lost or stolen devices. Besides that, most mobile devices are already logged into social media accounts, emails, bank accounts, so if the device gets stolen, it will be pretty easy to get access to all those things. Now, one prevention or measure that you can do to prevent losing your device is to turn on device tracking, which exists in both iPhone and Android. On iPhone, it's called Find My iPhone, and on Android, it's called Find My Device. Next thing we have, which is also quite important, if not the most important, and that is software security. As we know, any program is software, and having bugs in softwares can result in critical vulnerabilities. That's why it's important to regularly check for any logs that might indicate software acting weird or not doing what it's supposed to be doing. And even more important is to check for security bugs during the production of that software while it's still not published. Besides this, we also have something called advanced data security. Nowadays, data has become a primary target in many cybersecurity attacks, and more individuals and corporations are opting to spend more money and resources on securing their confidential data. Every day, there are more reports of data breaches where users' data is stolen by hackers, and this landscape is constantly changing. A data security engineer's job is to prevent this and to focus on giving the right data to the authorized users as well as prevent any data breaches. This is a really promising position, as we have already mentioned, and it's currently on a rise due to all the recent attacks. Another thing that is also promising is focusing on cloud security. Today, cloud is being used more and more. Now, even though it made everything easier and solved a bunch of problems, there is one main issue here. Whenever you use cloud, you're trusting a third party with your data and your security and privacy. This is a big concern. That's why cloud vendors will try to hire best cloud security experts to make sure their clients are happy and that their data is well protected. As a cloud security expert, you will have the skills to ensure that data and systems are secure on the cloud platform. You will ensure that apps running from the cloud cannot be manipulated by third parties, and you will also ensure that the data stored on the cloud is secure and cannot be accessed by unauthorized parties. Another interesting position is being a penetration tester. This is the most fun since you get to hack stuff legally. Companies pay you to break into their systems and discover as much vulnerabilities that you possibly can. Whether them being critical or low vulnerabilities, it doesn't matter. Besides this, another big thing today is something called DevSecOps. Now, you probably have heard about DevOps, and DevSecOps is rather the similar thing, or same thing, except the fact that anyone involved in a software development is responsible for bringing together development and security. Initially, security used to be an afterthought, and the development team would build the software first and then integrate security into it. DevSecOps pretty much discourages this and instead enforces a new development approach where security is tightly coupled with all other software development phases. And last but not least is Internet of Things security, which is another thing currently on the rise. IoT devices are being targeted by hackers and are being used as points of entry into organizations or homes. Since the devices are normally connected to a network, hackers are breaching the devices and navigating through the network to attack other devices on it. For instance, a hacker might breach an Internet of Things device and get into the network to spread malware to all the computers sharing the same network with the device. Someone who is interested in being an IoT security expert has to do several things. First one is to understand the IoT process as well as understanding the engineering of the product. And with that knowledge, he can then secure the device and implement a security policy. It is already expected to have more and more Internet of Things devices in the market in the future, so security jobs in this field will also increase. Okay, so we mentioned different types of securities in this field and gave an in-depth view on what all of them are focused on. Now, there are some of them that we didn't cover since we mentioned them previously, and those are something like incident responding and forensics. We talked about that before. And pretty much the idea behind this topic is that there is a place for anyone in this field. Whichever path you choose, you won't regret it. Now that we know the basics of cybersecurity, what it does, what it protects, what are blue team and red team, and what type of securities are there, let's dive straight into the first topic ahead of us.